to let you in on a secret. I stole these slides from a colleague. He doesn't know, actually. So if you see me looking at my phone, it's not because I'm checking my Facebook feed, it's because I'm looking at my notes. So, as Joshua said, I'm from the RISE Research Institutes of Sweden. We're Sweden's largest collection of research institutes, actually, with 2,200 employees. We cover a huge range of areas, but the reason I'm here today is for a very special hat, in a sense, that I wear, which is on behalf of Mission Innovation. And I think this is a really interesting evening because we cover really special mix of different people here, from climate scientists, and I guess that we're all here for similar reasons, through to startup companies and investors. And in a way, what I'd like to talk to you about this evening links all of these together. But as you all know, we need to accelerate our efforts when it comes to climate change, and we need to do that quite drastically. If we are looking at scenarios in which we try to limit the temperature rise to around 1.5 to 2 degrees, then our emissions need to reduce drastically, and they need to do so very soon. And we're doing quite a good job. Our progress is good, but relatively speaking, we're going backwards. Because if you look at the gap between our improvements, how the things that we are doing better, and where we actually need to be, that gap is increasing. And I'm old enough to realize that there has been an extraordinary change, technological change in the last 30, 40 years. That it gets to a pace now where it's quite difficult to keep up with, in many senses. But actually we're on the brink of an even faster change that can fundamentally change the way that we live and the way that we think about society and we think about the systems in which we live. And this gives us an opportunity, actually. It's an opportunity to take advantage of this change and consider how we could be doing things differently and how the choices that we make now have repercussions for the future and how they can accelerate the kind of change that we need to make. When we talk about reductions in emissions, very often what we are discussing are the assumptions that the development path that we have is fairly linear, with some degree of error when we consider our projections into the future. But in reality, the choices we make can lead to very different paths. And those paths can appear to be good in the short term, but end up locking us into situations which, in the longer term, we need to avoid. And I think really a very crucial event took place last year in October when the IPCC released its special report in October, which for the first time included a pathway which doesn't rely on negative emissions technologies. And negative emissions technologies are important. We need to be considering these. We need to hope that they work. But there is a risk associated with relying on negative emissions technologies. And the P1 pathway that was introduced in October introduces a new approach where we start to look at low energy demand scenario. The low energy demand scenario, it takes a different focus. Instead of taking the SDG 13, the Climate Action Sustainable Development Goal, as its starting point, it takes 12, which is production and consumption. And by doing that, what we see are an increased synergies between all of the SDGs, which also leads to a reduction in emissions. As I said, it's very interesting. Here we have people from startups, we have investors in a sense, I represent the other end of the scale because the project that I'm working on is for mission innovation, and mission innovation was launched at COP21 in Paris by 20 countries who represent 80% of global investments in clean research and development. And the target of mission innovation when it was launched was to double these governments' investments in clean energy technologies over a 5-year period, and also to encourage private the acceleration of private sector investment. What's interesting here in this photo, for those who are close enough to see it, is that we have Bill Gates standing shoulder to shoulder with some of the leaders of the world, including Obama and Trudeau. And this represents something that's quite unique about this initiative, which is the public-private coalition that exists. And in a way that this is what the project that we have started is all about. So the framework for assessing avoided emissions was proposed by Sweden at Mission Innovation's 3rd ministerial meeting, which took place in Malmö last year. And it was accepted into the action plan. And the objective that we have essentially is to provide strategic guidance for funders and investors to know what investments are the most impactful. So what we are developing is a framework. This framework is very broad. At the heart of the framework is a methodology for quantifying the avoided emissions potential of different innovations. And as an example here, for the next Mission Innovation Ministerial, which is taking place in Vancouver in May this year, we will be giving examples of 100 solutions which each have a potential impact of at least 10 megatons of CO2 by 2030. And when I say by 2030, that's a significant small point, because perhaps one of the differentiating factors of this is that we are looking into the future. And this is why it's important for investors, because we are trying to give some guidance as to what are the investments that can have an impact in the future, not only an impact today. So I won't go too much into detail on how the methodology works, but it's based on established techniques of life cycle analysis, greenhouse gas protocol, and we essentially make a comparison between the reductions that are possible today relative to the reductions that are possible in 2030. And an important trend that we see through this framework is that the financial sector is slowly moving away from divestment in so-called dirty technologies and companies where they are looking for simply reductions on their existing emissions, what we consider to be kind of old school thinking, more towards what are the opportunities, where are the investments that we should be making to have a real impact in society. And these very often will be innovations which, startups which, for example, may be the big companies in 10 years' time. And this is interesting to governments too. And we're based in Sweden. Some of our funding comes from the Swedish Energy Agency. By the way, our funding also comes from Climate Kick, which is European funding. They have recently started to look at, okay, how do the companies that they support, that they give funding to, what is the actual impact of those companies? But what they found was extremely interesting, that where the average emissions from one of their portfolios that they had invested in was around 15 megatons, a large number of those had relatively insignificant impact, but there were a few with a really big impact. And they were not the ones that they expected, and they were not the ones that they were promoting necessarily. Some of the ones they were promoting looked good and followed what people expected to be high emissions, but the reality was something different. So this is just an example of if we have a framework in which we have guidance for selecting the right innovations, maybe, just maybe, we can have the impact that's needed and accelerate the impact that's needed to tackle the climate change problem. I won't talk so much about how the framework is structured, but essentially it's in 3 steps to reframe the way that we think, to move away from this thinking of divestments towards a thinking of what are the solutions that we can consider as opportunities for the future. And then once we've achieved that, to reprioritize and say, okay, if these are the opportunities we have, which are the ones that we should be investing in? And then to accelerate that process. So to kind of bring this a little bit down to earth, how could this impact you? How could you have an effect on this? We have open on our website the possibility to nominate solutions, and I think some of the startups we've seen here today would be very interesting to see nominated. We have so far, I think, around 600 nominations. And also the opportunity to become a framework explorer, and there are a couple here today, Spring of course being one, and I thank you very much for the invitation to talk about this, and Clean Tech Scandinavia we have also here tonight, and others, and the framework explorers are basically organizations who are interested in the development of this framework, how they could be involved and how it could help them. So this can range from universities to cities to large institutional investors. And then the framework is essentially open source. On the website it's possible to make contributions directly in a kind of wiki style system. And this is not intended to be a closed tool. The idea is that this will remain public. And if you want to know more, you're welcome to look at the website. I was Jay Hennessy speaking. If you'd like to contact me for more information, you have my email address. Thank you very much.